Wohoro Ndohho is our friend and he's our guest this morning in the show. Wohoro, good morning.
Morning.
Very good to have you here again.
Asante sana. It's been a while.
Wohoro, you're here today, now not in the context of SMEs and the good work that you do in SMEs, but also because of what you've done in public service as a former head of the Debt Management Office in the National Treasury. Karibu to Kenya's biggest conversation.
Asante sana.
City Muga has the day's proverb. These week's proverbs are from Zambia.
Whose president is called Hakainde Hichilema, and whose vice president is called Mutale Nalumango.
Mutale Nalumango.
Yes.
Right.
There's no James, Peter, Paul, Bana.
It's like Regathi Gachagua.
But I'm sure if you go back into history, you'll find some Gilbert somewhere.
Wow.
Okay. If you told those guys, see that we're having a problem with Mutale Namulai, tell them our vice president, our deputy president will be Rigathi Gachagua.
Yes.
They'll be having an issue.
Yes. Well, we'll tell him if you have a problem, we can ask you. We can ask him and he can tell us what his Gilbert name was. Yes. Right. Don't start a fight just because your companion is strong.
Don't start a fight just because your companion is strong. Wohoro.
It reminds me of my brother when I was in high school. I was our firstborn, and I grew tall very quickly. And I was known to be quite a good fighter. There isn't a day I didn't spend, at least in a week, I didn't spend one day with the headmaster, communing with the headmaster.
Why?
She was in a fight.
You were rebel rouser.
Yeah, believe it or not.
Because you were the big boy.
No, the problem was my brother, he would pick fights with other kids.
Because his brother
big
is a
bro
big
isn't. So I suppose it's an equivalent in life, and that is the same thing with power, I think. Yeah. Just because you have power doesn't mean you should throw it around.
Or because just you know somebody in power.
Or you know somebody in power. Very apt.
You become not, the person who's not good.
And someone says, do you know me? Do you know who I know?
Do you know who I know?
Then there's a problem.
I know people,
I know
friend.
people in this town.
I know people.
That's right.
We're having some serious conversation as a country right now.
Yep.
Because we are discussing next year's financial budget. There is what the executive is proposing. This is what we'd like to spend. Of course, Parliament when I told them spend 80 billion shillings more. What's wrong with you? Now our budget is about 3.7 trillion shillings for the next year.
Right.
With the projected revenues of about 2.5. Right? And of course, appropriations in aid were 2.8. And then there's a deficit to finance.
That's right.
And deficit means?
You're spending more than you're earning.
Okay.
Right.
And it means where are you getting the money?
You have to borrow.
Okay. So we're basically talking about Parliament allowing the government to borrow a certain amount of money in the next financial year. And this has been happening in this country for several years. That is approved limits of borrowing.
Right.
We have been having this discussion here that our debt register now reads at about 9.7 trillion?
Yes, 9.67.
So 9.7 trillion is what we have borrowed. Is it what we owe?
It's the nature of what you owe and how you owe it. Yeah, that's what you owe, but it's also then chopped up into, of course, concessional and non-concessional. And then, of course, with 2014, with us rebasing our budget, we became lower middle income. We joined the big boys, like I said last time, and I think chickens came home to roost thereafter. And so, to that extent, yes, there's a question of that division. Just 9.7 billion by itself, a trillion by itself, isn't a bad number until you now disaggregate it. And you'll find, of course, the Chinese have $6 billion in there. Then the Eurobonds have another 4 billion there. And then syndicated loans is another, 2.8 billion in there, dollars. So it all adds up. The question then is, what do you do with the different types of debt? And what are the impacts of you entertaining such strange
having
ideas,
all those things,
like defaulting on loans?
Okay. will come to defaulting.
Yeah.
First of all, just so that we understand, we know the National Treasury, the CS, there are very many departments within there, and then now we know there's the Debt Management Office. What is that office?
It's charged by under the PFM Act to basically manage the debt of this country in a way in accordance with, of course, the constitutional principles. One among which, by the way, which one talks about is intergenerational equity. You should only borrow in such a way that you do not transfer that load to future generations, among other things. The two big words in debt management is prudent and informed decision making. So then the question becomes, if you're going to do that, even the law anticipated, in fact the Constitution anticipated, but then it translated in the law to give that office a measure of independence. Like, for example, how the IMF and World Bank insist on the independence of the central bank. There's a reason for that, because it's about confidence, it's about being able to speak truth to power, and within that context, then make sure we don't get to where we are right now.
When you say a measure of independence, what do you mean?
Independent from what?
Well, the PFM Act does anticipate that the Public Debt Management Office would be a semi-autonomous entity. In a perfect world, it should be totally autonomous. But of course, for obvious political economic issues, it wouldn't. But the idea of its semi-autonomy should be that it should be able to be removed from the politics of the day. It should be able to have the independence to then make decisions on the best costed debt. What's the most efficient debt for it to pick?
Okay.
Now, if you had stuck with that, what would have happened, even though we rebased our economy in 2014 and became a lower middle-income country, would have said, well, yes, just because you've now been given a gold credit card doesn't mean you go out and spend it. You know, because when you spend a credit card, you're actually in the open international markets, and those markets are mechanical, and they're mechanically brutal in terms of you keeping your word. You could have stuck with concessional debt, which is World Bank, at 1.2%, with a 10-year grace period over 40 years. Sounds wonderful, but the moment we rebased and became a low middle-income country, we immediately became uneligible for some of those loans. And then the rest is history.
I really want you to explain this thing. This rebasing the economy seems to be the enemy here. When we rebase the economy, what exactly do we do?
Well, I think the United Nations Economic Commission recommends that a country should look at all the sectors that make up your economy every 5 years and say, have we caught a sufficiently large enough basket of the sectors in the economy? Now, what happened in 2014 is we're up, and usually tends to follow or close to also when you do your population census. But in 2014, one of the questions was asked that at the time, one example of a sector that was about to take off was the telecom. The whole notion around the IT and telecommunications becoming a very significant sector in an economy. Now, if you are basing your GDP prior to that, you will have sectors that have evolved since you last did your rebasing. So the question is, you're supposed to then to look at your economy and says, are there sectors that have increased in significance that now need to have their own category? Are there other sectors that need to be removed because they're not as important? Now, of course, for us, when we then brought in, I think the big one, of course, was telecoms and IT, information-based sector of the economy. That's added significantly now to what we should add to the basket of sectors that make up the Kenyan economy. And lo and behold, and then the other thing, of course, is also what they say, pricing of GDP. You must always pick what they call a base year. Right, and that's part of what, and that really is to take advantage, to adjust for the effect of inflation over time. Otherwise, you end up with a situation where your numbers look really good, but you're still using prices that are long since non-applicable.
Yeah.
A good example of that is there's a time I know growing up when you had a shilling actually meant something. You could do something with a shilling. Now, if you have 100 bob, I think that same 100 bob is about the same effect as a shilling back then. So if you have to base your economic analysis on the shilling of then, which has depreciated by 99%, then clearly you skew your economic data. So that's why you have to rebase it and say, okay, in terms of the shilling is based on 2014, let's say. That's adjusted for inflation. So we say if the GDP based on the shilling this at 2014, this is the size of economy. And on top of that, we've looked at what other sectors that we've not included in the basket.
So you're saying we look at all these sectors, what they amount to, what they bring in, what they cost, and then we recalibrate and we rework our maths. And when you do the arithmetic, the sum total means we are no longer where we were before.
Well, yeah. As a general rule, when you're growing an economy, it's very dynamic, right?
Things will change.
Things will change,
and that's what we call rebasing.
It's basically taking into account that several key things change. Yes.
But these are positive changes.
Yes, by and large, it can also be negative.
So if it's negative and we rebase,
you can go backwards. Yes,
you can rebase backwards.
Yes,
but nobody, no one wants to do that.
Why?
Because there's some benefits once you rebase. For example, once you move from what they call highly debt-dependent nations or highly indebted nations, there are certain things that are not available to you. Okay. Key among which is the fact that if you're seen to be a least developed country, you can only ever borrow from the World Bank and IMF. It's almost like in kindergarten, and you cannot graduate from kindergarten.
You have to be told you have to be given instructions on how to behave.
Because basically they're telling you need help, and because it's our money, this is how you're going to do it.
We're going to control how.
When you're rebased, you're basically literally given a credit card. But then when you're given that credit card, you're also told you no longer belong to this concessional debts.
Yeah, you're not getting a food stamp anymore.
No more food stamps. But then that also means that when you get into international international financial markets, they don't, those guys don't want to know what you want to go do with your money.
Okay.
So everyone aspires to become a place where if you just want to borrow, they ask you, are you good for the money? Okay. That's only question.
That's it.
Can you repay?
You have a gold credit card.
Yeah. No, yes, they assume that you're in the club now. And you remember, of course, that when you take even Eurobond and syndicated loans, once you've become a low-middle income country, a key part of even the bond buyers, and who then buy your bonds, your Eurobonds.
It's because of this.
They know, of course, they have analysts who followed you very, very carefully. You've got dedicated analysts just to you as a country.
Yeah.
And a key thing that people don't realize is a key part of that assessment is actually your opinion of the World Bank and IMF.
Okay, you talk about highly indebted nations. What are the characteristics of a highly indebted nation, so that we can now go to another point?
One, that its expenditure, its revenues are way, way below way below its what it needs to spend. It tends to be very much primary commodity oriented. It also tends to be one that it has not evolved a sufficient level of sophistication in the economy for it to be able to access other forms of finance or attract other forms of investment. There's a minimum critical scale at which even foreign investors will say, now we want to get into your country. A good example of it is just infrastructure. Part of the reason why we can't run away from infrastructure. If you've been independent for 10 years and you're saying you've got agriculture, if an investor is going to come and put up a 10,000-acre farm to produce XYZ, then you want to be sure that that farm has, at a bare minimum, passable roads to take the product to market. Now, if you don't have that, then you have to then depend on borrowing or other people's money, but other people whose drive is not necessarily interest. You're still in what you call your development phase. And so then you're tied to the likes of the World Bank and IMF.
Is Kenya a highly indebted nation?
Technically, as a percentage of its total GDP, no, it's not.
Okay.
And also the rebase also means that there's a signal we've sent to international markets that we are sufficiently sophisticated. And we have a track record, by the way, and the track record is everything, which is that conversation about
tunaweza lipa.
Tunaweza lipa.
Okay. All right. Now, I want to go back to the question that Eric asked. Does Kenya owe, from the debt register that we see, okay, many would argue that the one that we see today is not up to date, all right? But does Kenya actually owe what it says it does?
The short answer is yes, but of course it's more nuanced than that. And that is because a certain level of a certain level of opaqueness, which is, I think, one of the underlying conversations in the public square, means that we don't know the extent of the conditions. For example, you say like 9.7 trillion.
Yeah.
If you see half of it, it's about 4.5 is commercial.
Yeah.
Now, if of that, half of that, if 6 billion of it has to do with a bilateral loan, which is actually supposed to be cheaper and it's between two countries, but the Chinese bilateral loan has the distinction of being not quite like other bilateral loans in that it's fairly commercial and it's tied to particular projects.
Yeah.
So in that context, then that's why I say the answer is nuanced in that the lack of being able to know that detail. If you're prudent, you'd say then you better err on the side of saying yes, it has a huge impact on our sustainability.
So it is possible, or rather what we're saying, it is not possible to say that you have this amount of debt and that money then that is being paid as debt is going somewhere else. That situation is not possible.
It's very unlikely. I'll tell you why. One is because there's a condition precedent for any loan across the board, especially bilateral, but especially commercial, is that you commit rightward, and you must actually commit it constitutionally in paying them first, even before you pay the public servants. So then in itself, the very interest of your creditors makes sure that a lot of that is on board. I think it's part of the reason why the Chinese conversation is so interesting, because I think for the first time we've got to a situation where there is some level of lack of sufficient transparency to know exactly what the terms and conditions of that were. And to me, the conversation really about debt is really not so much about debt, but about the mechanisms we have for holding leadership accountable, but also having an independence in the way that process is executed.
So then why wouldn't a debt register then be made public and up to date? Why would it be hidden somewhere in the dusty corners of a department where you used to sit? Why would that happen?
Oh, look, back in the day, I'm sure there were a lot of issues around efficiency of record keeping. There's a lot of probably not always a very close monitoring of what debts have been paid off, what are still owing. But I think the conversation around the debt register actually came alive around when the Chinese debt came into the picture, because the amounts were so large. But also, ironically, it's because also Chinese debt came with a literal transformation of our landscape. So, it's a chicken and egg situation. We could see up before Chinese debt. Remember, we would see debt, but we were almost acclimatized to not necessarily seeing what it's doing.
Where the money was going.
Yeah. So to be fair, Chinese debt also came with a literal transformation of a landscape. But then we ask, this is wonderful. So what are the conditions? And then we realize it's part of maybe a Chinese state policy that these are very tied, very closely guarded financial arrangements with the host governments. And I think a lot of our beef is around that particular
issue.
Question.
You have said, and it's there, that the first charge of the consolidated fund is pay debt. Even before you pay a salary, before you pay rent, before you pay power, pay debt. Okay? That means that constitutionally, PFM Acts and all other laws and regulations completely understand that the first thing that will do is money will be going to pay debt.
Right.
And there's a schedule of what debt is to be paid at what time.
That's correct.
Yep. So who's in charge of that? Who signs off that, okay, so this month we are paying Ndu, bring the check, I've signed.
Oh, no, that's a function of the PDM, or the Public Debt Management Office.
So the people in charge of the Public Debt Management Office are the ones who basically...
Well, we have the schedule. They have the schedule of doing
you have the
that.
schedule,
Yeah.
and you have now the repayments. Is it possible for money to be paid out of the consolidated fund
Mm-hmm.
to go to pay debt in quotes and not end up going to pay debt?
Well, technically, anything is possible. I mean, you can't rule that out. Remember that what makes it very watertight is the fact that you have a creditor on the other end
Who's waiting for them?
who's probably committed more resources on monitoring you than you yourself are keeping for yourself. So there's that self-interest sort of self-balances in situations like that. So it's very unlikely, unless it's deliberate.
Why I'm asking that is because we had Senator Okiya Omtata here, and he said he's going to court. Among the things that he wants to raise is, if you look at how much we have borrowed as a country between 2013 and 2022,
yes.
if you look at how much we have been repaying as a country between 2013 and 2022, there should be a difference. This is the amount of money you borrowed. You bought a car, you borrowed 2.5 million shillings from the bank. You have been making monthly repayments. Your loan can't still be the same, surely.
Yeah.
And that's the question he's asking. Why is our loan still 9.8 trillion shillings, and yet every year we are repaying?
Before you even
Or did we take these loans which should never move? You pay and just remains the same.
It's giving money for free.
You know, I can see where he's coming from. I mean, one, of course, is a question of pricing that debt in terms of, if he's talking dollars to dollars, then you could make a case for, why is it not dropping? But also the nature of debt is a bit different in that your stock of debt doesn't drop because you're paying every month, because you're paying interest, right? Like to the Eurobond.
Okay.
The Eurobond is like any other debt you take in a bank.
Yes.
You pay interest, you pay interest, you pay interest. Then you have what you call a bullet
First
payment.
installment is 98% interest.
Well, actually, it's a bit different. I say it's for mortgage.
98 bob interest, 2 bob principal.
But actually, in most of like Eurobond debt and even syndicated debt tends to be quite different in that you say you commit to a series of payments, annuities of interest, right? At the end of which you return the money you borrowed, right? So if I borrowed $2 billion in Eurobond, that's how Eurobond works. You say we've agreed on 5.8%. So, and that's payable every 6 months, right? Okay. It's payable. That's annual interest is payable every 6 months or whatever you agree.
Okay.
So every 6 months you're paying the interest component. Then you have the bullet payment at the end. And what we call a bullet payment is that the $2 billion you borrowed, you have to then return it.
So you now return.
So it's like employing your money to do work for you. So hopefully in the time that you borrowed the $2 billion, you put it to work so that it's generating a revenue stream to meet your interest, but also to grow your asset base so that you're returning it to
You'll
10 years from now.
At least like a B.
So all this money we are paying, we're just paying interest.
For like the Eurobonds and syndicated loans.
Syndicated loans.
Yeah.
So, but then when we say that we owe 9.8 trillion shillings, is that just the principal we've borrowed? Is that what we talk about?
Yes, that's a stock. Now,
this 9.8 trillion does not talk about the interest.
Yeah, so that's the question. In fact, for investors, the bigger question is not normally your stock of debt. It's when they look at your stock of debt, they look at your debt servicing, which is where you're paying the interest. And they look at your servicing of that debt and they say, okay, the only way you can finance, especially if it's in dollars, the only way you can finance your interest is we want to know the sources of your exchange and foreign exchange. So they say, okay, first thing, you export.
Yeah.
So they ask, so what is your total export income relative to your debt servicing? A very important performance metric.
Okay.
Another question they ask is, okay, what are the sources? Okay, if you are like Kenya, you've got a big diaspora now. So the diaspora
is a source.
They say, okay, they factor that in. Convincing them of that revenue stream in terms of once you're growing your export base, you have other sources like diaspora, then they can say the decision, okay, in the basis of that, I think there's room here to lend you X amount. But the analysts sitting in Washington or Beijing, they are dedicated analysts who want to look at Kenya. Especially, like, you can bet for...
There's a Kenya desk.
There's a Kenya desk in each of them, as for every other country.
Yeah.
And those ones then monitor to make sure. So that's the questions around, when we started having the debate about the balance of payments, a balance of trade conversations. There are people who are very, very interested because it speaks to that, sustainability of paying that interest.
Let's take a break. Hey, some good lessons we're learning this morning.
Spice.
Wohoro Ndohho, former Director General of the National Debt Management Office in the National Treasury, understanding debt management, debt repayments, in light of the conversations that have been happening around the country now about debt. So, is it possible, Wohoro, that Kenya at some point signed for a debt, has gone to borrow? Okay, of course, the concessionary multilateral loans and bilateral, those ones, it's a bit. But the commercial loan, there's a possibility. Is there a possibility? Gone, said you've borrowed the money, received money from lenders, money is supposed to come and enter into the system for development projects, and then money disappears before hitting said development.
Technically speaking, if there's going to be any mischief, it will happen once it's in our system. But as I said, because it's a commercial
By
loan,
being in our system, what does that mean?
it means, I'll give you an example. Every country on earth has, and that's changing, of course, every country on earth tends to have an account with the Federal Reserve, especially New York. I know the Federal Reserve is seven basically regional reserves that form the Federal Reserve. And so, as a general rule...
Why does every country in the world have an account with them?
That's a conversation, a whole conversation for another day. Suffice it to say, when they then raise... part of the reason is also a confidence issue, and that's a structure of international finance.
Okay.
So when you launch your Eurobond, and the investors say, yes, we're going to buy a bond, then they ask, where do we deposit the money? Now, they could deposit the money into Kenya's bank account with Chase Manhattan. But, it's a sovereign country, right? So, as a general practice, then they say that you can deposit these funds with the Federal Reserve or for your credit.
Okay.
Now, the moment it enters the Federal Reserve account for Kenya then chooses what to do with it. It can then... Actually, by law, it's supposed to then transfer it immediately to the consolidated fund. So that's a clear chain of custody. So
that is, in theory, what's supposed to happen.
No. That's how it happens. You don't have a choice. Because, remember your lenders in the first instance want to see, they don't say you've gone and put it,
there's some accountability there.
$2 billion, and you've gone and put it into a Karomaindo account somewhere. that chain must be clear. So once it gets in there, then, you have signed the document, you now owe that money. Now, the moment you do that, then the prerogative of the National Treasury is to move those funds, in whole or in part, into the consolidated fund. And even that transfer is also mandated by law. So you cannot move it from that Federal Reserve account to Mr. Wohoro's personal US account. Or, it has to come, that chain of custody must come here. But of course, as famous politicians once said, money is fungible. The moment it enters the pot, then it just becomes part of the general budget support.
Money.
Can I ask, who is responsible for oversight? That when this money comes in, there must be somebody. There must be an office, there must be a department who says, okay, this is this money coming in, because if we can dumb it down, if we can simplify it so we can understand exactly what's happening here. When money comes in, who's responsible to say, okay, this is Eurobond. This is what it's supposed to be. This is what it is meant for. Is it following the chain that it is meant to? And if it doesn't, apart from the Auditor General's one, after all has been said and done, jumps up and says, hold on a minute, this was supposed to be for this, it didn't happen. But who looks at this thing, essentially, and says, hold on, guys, you said this money was supposed to be for this, it is not going there?
I mean, that's always the responsibility of the economic manager of the country, which is the National Treasury.
Okay.
And within the National Treasury, the specialist department that looks to the detail of how that is done is the PDMO. So the question then really, and sometimes I feel like it sort of gets distracted. That chain of custody is easy to prove. But the question then becomes that once it arrives into the consolidated fund, it becomes general budget support. So what I need to make clear is that once it enters that pot called the consolidated fund, the division between what it was purposed for and what happens happens the next time you see how it's then split up is in fact in terms of where the monies are allocated, and you trace where the monies are allocated.
So you're saying until it has been spent, it sits there. But until it has been spent is when you can now come back and say, okay, divvied up, it went here, it was supposed to go here. So before that, what we're saying is that anybody can do anything inside here, and we will not be able to ask questions until after the fact.
For it to be withdrawn from that fund, there's a control of budget.
Okay, yeah.
Which is part of it. And I think you're reinforcing my point. Part of the reason why our constitution was crafted the way it was to create a very distinct points in that chain of custody. From the moment the money is raised in the US, it arrives here, and any money leaving the consolidated fund, that's why you have the PFM. Now, the trick here is to be able to do your analysis to ask the question, okay, where is the money coming? I'm not talking necessarily the budget. How is the money being dispersed from the consolidated fund? So there's a little trick, but a little a really interesting question I'd put to analysts. And that is, forget the budget. If you went and looked at how actual outgoings, how actual money leaves and spent, you could have a very interesting analysis. For example, at the end of every year, okay, the government budgeting is cash. Yes. It's cash-based. It's not accrual, which basically means you spend what you collect. So you can't spend more than what you've collected, right? So if at the end of every year you said how much came in, how much left out, technically speaking, you can't really have a deficit.
It should balance.
It should balance.
Yes.
Now, what then? When you then compare that year on year, going back 10 years, and then trace that against our budgets, which is your spending plan, that could be a very interesting conversation, because you will see there's a bit of a difference, and that's because when the government is spending with third parties, the commitments are multi-year, so there's an element of accrual in there, but that's only in the budgeting. In the spending, you can then go year by year and say how much has been spent on every specific item on the budget, and ignoring the actual budget, you compare then the actuals against the budget. That difference there could tell, I think, can create a lot of confusion, which is part of the reason why when you see like our budget right now, it's a 3.4? Is it 3?
The current year?
Yeah.
The one that we are finishing.
Yeah, the trillion, yeah.
Right now is a 3.2.
3.2. There was 3.2 against 2.4. So it's almost like a trillion difference there.
Yeah.
That also accommodates past commitments that are going to fall due, even as you're adding to those our present commitments. But technically, at the end of the financial year, you can only spend what you've collected. And that's where now the likes of even bilateral lending, for example, a lot of bilateral lending is disbursed as the project needs it. So it's not like it's given lump sum, and then you have to hold it somewhere until you're ready to use it.
Let's come to the question that's a big one now on debt. So there have been several suggestions. Number one, can we open the books, put all the papers on this table, and audit this debt? Look at the amounts approved by Parliament. Look at the actual amounts borrowed. Look at where the money went. Trace it. This money was going to a certain dam called the Wake Dam. this is it, these are the invoices, this is the money where it went. Can we do that? If we do that and we find that there's some discrepancy, what do we do with it? One. Two, we are now, running against this clock. Oh my goodness, we are raising, we said we are hoping to raise 250 shillings next year. Out of that 250, 160 is going towards paying debt. We are basically left with no money for no wiggle room. What do we do about that? Can we default? Can we just call her and say, you know what, people,
We don't have
we declare bankruptcy?
buy and buy.
Okay. Yes, the second one, just censorship and that must fine. But to your first question, we do that every year in the budget conversation. Now, the difference might be in saying if this is a national conversation at this point in time, for example, even in fact, I would have said in the first 100 days, this government could easily have declared a national emergency, called a national economic forum, and had us have this debate openly before the finance bill was passed. Being that as it may, that decision was made. The only other way I think you can do that, I think, and you always go back to the law. You cannot do it outside the law. It is entirely possible that the oversight role of Parliament could say, we will introduce a bill to get to the bottom of this and do exactly that. And that bill will be very specific.
A forensic audit of our debt.
So now the big elephant in the room in these conversations is that the separation of powers is not. We've seen that the separation of powers is weak, so that one arm of government can dictate to another. That's a separate conversation. But to your first question, yes, you can do that. My view is that it should happen within the context, not just a PFM, but maybe an even more enabling special legislation that will say this is such a big issue that we, as the custodians of the people's sovereignty in Parliament, want to do this. Okay. So to me, I think there's a solution that. Now, to the question of default, no, you cannot default.
Why not?
I'll give you 4 reasons. In fact, I have more here. First and foremost, the reputational damage. Once you're known to be unreliable, you forget this happens even in life. When you forget, you skip a couple of people paying them, then what spreads about you're a bad guy. Then a day comes when you have a real emergency. And at that point, you realize just how much of lack of reputational capital is critical to you. So that's the first thing. Second thing, with a lot of Eurobond contracts and syndicated loans, they will tend to have a clause that says this. If you make any moves to look like you are trying to reach an accommodation with other creditors, however much debt relief, something innocuous says, just extend a little loan, can you adjust our current? Yes, I know we signed that. Can we sort of make some adjustments? In an Eurobond in the international market, there tends to be a clause that says, even if you make a move like that, we as your bondholders can deem that to be a technical default. So what does that mean? You do not want to do that unless you are someone like the World Bank, the IMF, sort of escorting you along. Because if your Eurobond holders decide that you've committed a technical default, then it triggers an immediate right to recall. Now, remember the bullet payment you talked about? Yes.
They can say, instead of waiting for this, now we want it now.
We want it now. But not just them. Everyone else who holds a bond, because it's a domino effect. Everyone else who holds your Eurobond will say,
I want my money today.
I want my money today. So you cannot default because of that. That's another reason you can't default.
Yeah, but it's not. Even if you remove our trousers and whip us.
I mean, what are you going to do?
There's no money.
There's no money. There's no money.
We're truthful
what are you
people.
going to do? Oh, really?
Now, yeah, but I'm giving you reasons why you don't want to do that. Secondly, if you then say, okay, let's say you have no money, you declare default, you are now a debtor, a pariah, right, internationally. Countries have been known for Kenya Airways flies into London, the airplane is impounded there. Every embassy you own on this planet,
they attach
everybody will catch it. Whatever assets you have out there, and it cannot touch. And there's nothing to stop them, in my view, from attaching even your citizens' assets. Now, they would do that. I mean, that would create a whole issue.
International issue, yeah.
But the reputation of a country then goes to the dogs. and any asset that you as a sovereign country own out there.
So no
becomes
default.
fair game.
Let's avoid defaulting. What can we do?
What you do is that you can renegotiate. Now, the only way you can renegotiate is the first place you must pass in that conversation, in that journey, is the likes of the IMF and World Bank. Which then you suck right back. You thought you were independent. You find yourself back. You've come back.
With your tail between your legs.
Yeah, well, maybe wiser for it.
So we're not really rebasing. We're really not going back.
So
to
if we do that,
I think we've had
with the backing then of the Bretton Woods, even these other bondholders would be what, lenient?
But you see, remember, that's always voluntary, because even if for example, you could reach an accommodation with some of the Eurobond, because they can see, well, Kenya is a strategic. I mean, that's the flip side of this is Kenya is a strategic country in Africa. If we let it default, the signal it sends across the continent could be disastrous for even them as investors. So it's a bit of
So we have
competitive. There's some leverage there, but not as much as we think. But you think of every other loan if you denominated in dollars. They all call in. They all stop bending us. Think about pension funds. These Eurobonds tend to be bought by pension funds of those other countries. Now, the political fallout of those other countries, those governments then saying Kenya's defaulted on borrowing this money.
That's why we can't pay our pensioners.
Yes, that's right. So just to me, that's a very sophisticated. That's part of the problem with it's more nuanced than that. So the question is not default; it's a question of how you reach an accommodation.
It's how you work around it.
That's right.
Wohoro, thank you very much. Lakini Wohoro atuna pesa. And Wambi. Wohoro Ndohho is former Director General of the National Debt Management Office. Thank you for tuning in to Kenya's biggest conversation. Have a lovely day. It's 10 a.m. Time for the news with Dennis.
This is the Situation Room, the only way